The phone vibrated against the scarred wood of the coffee table, a frantic, insistent buzzing that cut through the monotonous drone of the city traffic 10 floors below. For a moment, I let it go, watching the steam curl from the lip of my cheap ceramic mug. The coffee tasted bitter, metallic, a flavor I'd grown accustomed to over the past 5 years. It was the taste of solitude. The buzzing stopped, and a fragile silence settled over my small apartment, a silence filled only by the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint whisper of wind against the glass. I took a slow sip, the hot liquid scalding my tongue. Then the phone buzzed again. I knew, with a sinking certainty that felt like a stone dropping into a deep well, that this was not a call I could ignore. The name on the screen was a ghost from a life I had buried. Sarah, my sister. We hadn't spoken in 1,825 days, not since the day the locks on my childhood home were changed, and my name became a curse whispered behind closed doors. My thumb hovered over the screen, the skin of it suddenly feeling clammy and cold. I could feel my heart beginning to thud against my ribs, a heavy, panicked rhythm. I pressed the green icon. Her voice, when it came, was thin and reedy, stretched taut over a wire of unspoken panic. It was a voice I barely recognized, stripped of its usual melodic confidence. "Ethan?" "I'm here, Sarah," I said, and my own voice sounded rough and used, like an engine that hadn't been started in years. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, a tiny, hitching sound. "It's Dad," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. There was an incident. A heart attack. He's at St. Mary's. He's stable, they think, but, Ethan, Mom thinks you should come home." Home. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and complicated. Home was a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and a manicured lawn, a place that smelled of Mom's lavender potpourri and Dad's expensive cigars. It was also a courtroom, a place of judgment where I had been tried and convicted without a jury. The memories washed over me in a disorienting wave. The suffocating scent of my mother's disappointment, the sharp, cutting glint in my father's eyes, the way Sarah had looked at me, not with sympathy but with a chilling, detached pity. Is he going to be okay?" I asked, my throat tight. "We don't know," she whispered, and for the first time, a crack of genuine fear broke through her composure. "The doctor said the next 48 hours are critical. Please, Ethan, just come." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the hollow dial tone. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the hollowness inside my chest. The apartment, my small sanctuary from the world that had rejected me, suddenly felt like a cage. The gray walls seemed to be closing in, the air thick and stale with the smell of my own lonely existence. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane, a man in his early 30s with tired eyes and a 5-year shadow of grief clinging to him. The boy who had left that house, full of shame and rage, was gone. I wasn't sure who this man was, but he was about to find out. The drive was 6 hours long, a journey backward in time. With every mile that passed, the concrete and steel of the city bled into the lush, suffocating green of the suburbs. I rolled down the window, and the air changed. The sharp, metallic tang of the city was replaced by the thick, sweet scent of cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. It was the smell of my childhood, a scent so deeply ingrained in my memory that it made my stomach clench. I passed the old strip mall where I'd had my first job, the park where I'd had my first kiss, each landmark a small, sharp pinprick to the heart. This was a land of ghosts, and I was the one haunting it. As I turned onto Hawthorne Lane, the final street, my hands began to tremble on the steering wheel. The trees here were older, their branches forming a dense canopy that dappled the afternoon sun onto the asphalt. The houses grew larger, set further back from the road, each one a fortress of quiet, upper-middle-class prosperity. And then there it was, number 104. It looked exactly the same. The pristine white siding, the dark green shutters, the sprawling oak tree in the front yard that I had spent a whole summer trying to build a treehouse in. But something felt different. It was like looking at a photograph of a happy memory after you know the devastating truth of what came next. The house seemed colder, its windows like vacant eyes. It didn't feel like home. It felt like the scene of a crime. I pulled into the long driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires with a sound that was painfully familiar. I cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the chirping of a distant bird. For a full 5 minutes, I just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel, the worn leather cool and smooth beneath my sweating palms. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of stale car air and fresh-cut grass. I opened the door and stepped out. The air was warm and humid, clinging to my skin. The scent of my mother's prize-winning roses was a cloying, heavy perfume in the late afternoon heat. I walked up the bluestone path, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud. My hand hesitated over the ornate brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head. I remembered the day Dad installed it, how proud he was. He'd said it was a symbol of strength, of the family's legacy. I wondered what he would think of the stranger standing on his doorstep now. Before my knuckles could touch the metal, the door swung inward. My mother stood there, framed in the doorway. Eleanor. She looked older, the fine lines around her eyes and mouth etched deeper than I remembered. Her blonde hair was still perfectly coiffed, her silk blouse impeccably pressed. She wore the same expression of strained, polite composure that she had worn in the lawyer's office 5 years ago. It was a mask, and I knew every single crack in it. "Ethan," she said, her voice smooth but brittle like thin ice. "Mom," I replied, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. She didn't move to hug me. Instead, her eyes did a quick, critical scan, from my worn-out jeans to my scuffed boots to the tired lines on my face. It was a silent, thorough inventory of my failure. "You came?" Sarah called. "Yes." "Well, come in," she said, stepping back. Her perfume, a powerful lilac scent, washed over me as I crossed the threshold, and the familiar wave of nausea hit me. The house was just as I remembered, a museum of a life I was no longer a part of. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the scent of lemon polish and something else, something old and sad like dried flowers. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked with a loud, funereal rhythm, each tick a second of my life I could never get back. Sarah appeared from the living room, her face pale and drawn. She was wearing a cashmere sweater, even in the warmth of the house, and she had her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. Her eyes, my father's eyes, met mine for a fleeting second before skittering away. There was no warmth in them, only a deep, weary guilt. "Hi," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. Her husband, Mark, stood behind her, a hand resting on her shoulder. He was the picture of support, his jaw set, his expression grave. Mark, the perfect son-in-law, the man who had seamlessly stepped into the role I had vacated. He gave me a curt, formal nod. The air between us was thick with unspoken accusations, a fog of resentment so dense I could almost taste it. "How is he?" I asked, directing the question to the room at large. "He's resting," my mother said, her voice clipped. "The doctors want him to stay in the hospital for observation for at least a week. We were just about to head back there for evening visiting hours. You can come with us." It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. The drive to the hospital was a masterclass in suffocating silence. I sat in the back of my mother's pristine luxury sedan, the scent of new leather filling my nostrils. Sarah sat in the front, staring out the window, while my mother drove with a rigid focus, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the ghosts of every angry word, every tearful accusation from 5 years ago. I could feel their judgment pressing in on me from all sides, a physical weight on my chest that made it hard to breathe. St. Mary's Hospital smelled the way all hospitals do, a sterile, chemical blend of antiseptic and quiet despair. The linoleum floors squeaked under our feet as we walked down the hushed corridor. My mother led the way, her posture ramrod straight, a woman determined to project an aura of control even as her world was crumbling. Room 312. The door was slightly ajar. My mother pushed it open, and the rhythmic, metronomic beep of a heart monitor filled the small space. And there he was, my father, Richard, the man who had once seemed like a giant to me, a force of nature, now looked impossibly small and frail, lost in the starched white sheets of the hospital bed. Wires snaked from his body to a series of whirring machines. An oxygen tube was clipped to his nose. His skin was a pale, waxy gray, and his eyes were closed. The sight of him, so vulnerable, so utterly human, knocked the air from my lungs. The anger I had nursed for 5 years, the hard, bitter shell I had built around my heart, began to crack. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. His eyelids fluttered open. His gaze, usually so sharp and commanding, was cloudy with medication and fatigue. It drifted around the room, past my mother, past Sarah, and then it landed on me. For a long, stretched-out moment, he just stared. There was no recognition at first, just a confused fogginess. And then a flicker, a change. His brow furrowed, and a dark, familiar storm began to gather in his eyes. His mouth opened, and a dry, rasping sound came out. "You," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper of its former power. He tried to push himself up, a futile gesture of his old authority. A line on the monitor beside his bed jumped erratically. "What is he doing here? Get him out." "Richard, calm down," my mother said, rushing to his side, her voice a sharp hiss. "The doctor said you mustn't get agitated." "Get him out," he repeated, his voice gaining a sliver of its old strength, fueled by pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes, locked on mine, were filled with a 5-year-old betrayal that was as fresh as if it had happened that morning. "I don't want him here. He is not my son." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could feel Sarah and my mother watching me, their gazes burning into my skin. The beeping of the monitor grew faster, more frantic, a soundtrack to my humiliation. I took a step back, then another, until my back hit the cool, smooth surface of the door. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of my father's labored breathing and the insistent beeping of the machine chasing me down the hall. I didn't stop walking until I was outside, standing in the hospital parking lot, the cool night air a shock against my hot skin. I leaned against my car, the cold metal a welcome anchor in a sea of overwhelming emotion, and for the first time in 5 years, I let myself cry. The tears were hot and bitter, a poison I had been holding inside for far too long. He had banished me all over again. I spent that night in a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach, a scent that clung to the thin, rough bedspread. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, twisted with a hatred that felt ancient and absolute. The words, "He is not my son," echoed in the dark, cavernous space of the motel room. Was he right? The boy he had raised, the one who was supposed to take over the family business, Sterling Holmes, was gone. That boy had died 5 years ago in a sterile conference room, under the weight of falsified bank statements and my father's crushing disappointment. The scandal, as my mother so delicately called it, had been brutally simple. $250,000 had vanished from the company's operating account. A forensic accountant, hired by my father, had traced the transfers to an offshore account. An account opened in my name. I had sworn it wasn't me. I'd pleaded, I'd begged them to believe me. I had no idea how it had happened, but the evidence was a neat, tidy package of damnation. My password had been used. My digital signature was on the transfers. My father, a man who valued reputation and integrity above all else, had seen it as the ultimate betrayal. He didn't just fire me, he excised me from the family like a cancer. No police were involved. That would have brought shame and public scrutiny. Instead, my punishment was silent and absolute: exile. The next morning, driven by a masochistic impulse I didn't understand, I drove back to the house. My key, of course, no longer worked. I had to ring the bell like a stranger, the cheerful chime mocking me. Sarah answered, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "He's sleeping," she said, her voice flat. "Mom's with him." She didn't invite me in, just stood there, blocking the doorway. "Sarah, we need to talk," I said, my voice low. "I never did it. You have to know that. I would never, ever have done that to Dad." She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. "Don't, Ethan. Please. Not now. It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to me." My voice rose, louder than I intended, echoing slightly in the quiet morning air. It was my life, my future. He destroyed it based on a lie. "It wasn't a lie," she said, her voice gaining a defensive edge. The evidence was too perfect, Sarah. Didn't that ever occur to you? It was too clean. Someone set me up." She just shook her head, a sad, dismissive gesture. "Who would do that, Ethan? And why? It doesn't make any sense." She looked past me, her gaze distant, as if searching for an escape. "Mark is taking over Dad's duties at the office for now. Trying to keep things steady. It's a lot of pressure." The mention of Mark sent a strange, cold prickle down my spine. Mark had been the junior project manager back then, always eager, always helpful. He had been the one to first notice the financial irregularities, as he'd called them. He had brought them to my father's attention, looking grave and concerned. He had been so supportive of Sarah, so solid, during the whole ordeal. He had profited the most from my fall. "I want to go to the office," I said, the idea forming as I spoke it. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. "You can't. Dad would. He would lose his mind if he found out you were there." "He doesn't have to know," I said, a new, unfamiliar resolve hardening my voice. "I just want to look at something. The old project files from that year." The year it all happened. The Ashworth Project. The Ashworth Project. It was the biggest project Sterling Homes had ever undertaken, a luxury condo development that had been plagued with problems from the start. Cost overruns, subcontractor issues, zoning delays. It had been my responsibility, and its troubles had been the backdrop to the missing money, making my supposed theft seem all the more plausible. The desperate act of a son trying to cover up his professional failures. "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I can't let you do that, Ethan. You need to leave. You're just making things worse by being here." She started to close the door. "Or what, Sarah?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "You'll banish me again? I've got nothing left to lose." Her face crumpled, the carefully constructed mask of the dutiful daughter falling away to reveal the confused, scared woman underneath. For a second, I saw the sister I used to know, the one I'd built forts with in the living room and shared secrets with late at night. Then the mask was back in place. "Just go," she whispered, and closed the door, the soft click of the lock echoing the finality of my father's words in the hospital room. But I couldn't go. Not yet. A seed of suspicion, long dormant, was beginning to sprout. I was a ghost in this town, but ghosts can walk through walls. Or, in my case, they remember where the spare key to the back office door used to be hidden. That night, I waited until the moon was high and the street was cloaked in an inky, suburban darkness. The Sterling Homes office was a low-slung brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by landscaped bushes and an empty parking lot. It felt strange to be there, a trespasser in a place that was supposed to have been my birthright. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and asphalt. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence. The spare key wasn't under the loose brick by the back steps anymore. My stomach sank. Of course it wasn't. 5 years was a long time. But as my fingers scrabbled in the dirt, they brushed against something small and metallic. It had sunk deeper into the soil, but it was there. A small, cold sliver of hope. The key slid into the lock with a rusty scrape. I held my breath, turning it slowly. The tumblers clicked, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the dead of night. The door opened with a soft groan. I slipped inside, closing it gently behind me, and was plunged into a familiar darkness. The office smelled of stale coffee, industrial carpet cleaner, and paper. It was the scent of my past, of late nights and early mornings, of ambition and, ultimately, of failure. I didn't turn on the lights. I let my eyes adjust to the gloom, the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of empty desks. I navigated the space by memory, my feet finding the well-worn path to the file room at the back. The file room was my destination. It was a small, windowless space, and the air within it was thick and stagnant, heavy with the dust of forgotten years. I closed the door behind me and used the small flashlight on my phone, the narrow beam cutting a sharp white cone through the darkness. The shelves were lined with dozens of identical cardboard banker's boxes, each one labeled in my father's precise, angular handwriting. I ran the beam of light along the spines, my heart quickening as I saw the dates. 2017. 2018. There it was. 2019. Ashworth Project. I lifted the heavy box down, the cardboard rough and dry under my fingers. A small cloud of dust puffed into the air, making me cough. I set it on the floor and knelt, the cold concrete seeping through the knees of my jeans. I pried open the lid. Inside, packed tight, were endless manila folders, a dense archive of contracts, invoices, and change orders. It was all here. The story of my downfall, written in black and white. I started pulling out the files, my flashlight beam dancing over the pages. The numbers, the names of the subcontractors, it all came rushing back. I remembered the stress, the constant pressure from my father to get the project back on schedule and under budget. I remembered the arguments, the feeling of drowning in a sea of logistical nightmares. And then I saw it. Tucked into a folder labeled HVAC subcontractor, there was an invoice that felt wrong. It was from a company I didn't recognize, Mid-Valley Mechanical. The invoice was for $82,000 for an emergency equipment replacement. I had no memory of this. Sterling Homes had an exclusive, long-standing contract with a company called Peterson Air. We wouldn't have used anyone else. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the invoice. The paper felt different from the others, slightly thinner, the printing a fraction less crisp. I found the corresponding payment authorization form. The signature at the bottom was a near-perfect forgery of my own. But it wasn't mine. I could see the subtle hesitation in the loop of the E, the slightly different pressure on the cross of the T. It was good, frighteningly good, but it wasn't mine. I kept digging. I found another one, this time in the electrical file. Apex Wiring Solutions. $112,000. Another company I'd never heard of. Another perfect forgery. My breath hitched in my chest. This was it. This was how they did it. It wasn't one large, obvious transfer. It was a series of smaller, falsified subcontractor invoices, carefully buried within the chaotic paperwork of a troubled project. They added up to $250,000. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. Who had access to the project files? Who could authorize payments? Who could forge my signature so expertly? The list was short. Me, my father, and the project manager who oversaw the day-to-day paperwork. The man who had been my shadow on the Ashworth project. Mark. The thought was so jarring, so sickening, that I felt a fresh wave of nausea. Mark? Solid, dependable Mark? The man my sister loved? It seemed impossible. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to slot into place. Mark, who always stayed late. Mark, who had offered to help me with the overwhelming payment authorizations. Mark, who had discovered the theft and risen so quickly in the company in my absence. I needed more. This was a start, but it wasn't enough to blow a family apart for a second time. I needed to know if these companies, Mid-Valley Mechanical and Apex Wiring Solutions, were real. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I typed the names into the search bar. The signal was weak in the back of the building, the progress bar crawling at a snail's pace. Finally, the page loaded. Corporate registration records. Both companies had been registered just a few months before the invoices were dated, and they had been dissolved less than a year later, shortly after I was exiled. The listed address for both was nothing but a post office box in a town 50 miles away. They were shell corporations, ghosts, created for the sole purpose of laundering money out of sterling homes. My blood ran cold. I sat there on the dusty floor of the file room, the thin beam of my flashlight illuminating the fraudulent papers in my hand, and the full, crushing weight of the last 5 years came crashing down on me. I hadn't just been betrayed. I had been meticulously, brilliantly framed. And the architect of my ruin was sleeping in my sister's bed, playing the part of the concerned son-in-law, while my father lay in a hospital bed, hating me for a crime I didn't commit. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat, a mixture of a sob and a growl. The silence of the office was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, filled with the presence of a 5-year-old lie that had festered in the dark and poisoned everything it touched. I didn't go back to the motel. I couldn't. The sterile, anonymous room felt too much like the exile I had been living in. Instead, I drove to the hospital and spent the rest of the night in the uncomfortable plastic chair of the 24-hour waiting area. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the vending machines and the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoes on the linoleum. I sat there, the forged invoices tucked safely in the inside pocket of my jacket, their sharp corners pressing against my ribs like a constant, painful reminder. I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, the kind of clarity that comes after a violent storm. The rage was still there, a hot coal glowing in the pit of my stomach, but it was now focused, honed to a fine point. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a man with a purpose. I had to expose the truth, not just for my own sake, but for my father's. He deserved to know who had truly betrayed him. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep through the large waiting room windows, my mother and Sarah arrived. They looked exhausted, their faces etched with worry. They stopped short when they saw me, my mother's expression hardening into its familiar mask of disapproval. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a low, accusatory whisper. "I thought we made it clear." "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady and firm. I stood up, the stiffness in my limbs a dull ache. "All of us, including Mark." Sarah's eyes flickered with fear. "Mark's at home, trying to get some sleep. He was at the office until late last night, trying to hold everything together." "I'm sure he was," I said, a bitter edge to my words. "Call him. Tell him to meet us at the house. Tell him it's an emergency. Tell him it's about the Ashworth project." The name of the project hung in the air, and I saw a flash of something in Sarah's eyes. Not just fear, but a flicker of a memory, a dawning unease. She looked from me to my mother, her mouth slightly agape. "What is this, Ethan?" my mother demanded, her voice rising slightly. "What are you trying to do?" Your father is lying in that bed, and you're trying to cause more trouble. I'm trying to end it, I said, my gaze unwavering. I'm trying to uncover the truth you were all so quick to bury 5 years ago. I looked directly at Sarah. Call him. Something in my tone, in the cold certainty of my eyes, must have convinced her. She fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed. An hour later, we were all gathered in the formal living room of my parents' house. It was a room reserved for holidays and important guests, a space that always felt cold and unused. The air was thick with tension, heavy and hard to breathe. I sat in one of the stiff, brocaded armchairs, the fraudulent invoices feeling like a lead weight in my jacket pocket. My mother paced back and forth in front of the large, unlit fireplace, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Sarah sat on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between me and the door. We heard his car pull into the driveway, the crunch of the gravel a prelude to the coming storm. A moment later, Mark walked in. He was dressed in a crisp suit, looking tired but composed. He feigned a look of concern as he saw our grim faces. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice smooth and reassuring. He walked over to Sarah, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Is it your father? Did something happen?" "He's the same," my mother said, stopping her pacing to fix me with a glare. "This is about Ethan. He's making allegations." Mark's gaze shifted to me. His expression was a carefully crafted blend of sympathy and weariness. "Ethan, look. I know this is a difficult time, but dragging up the past isn't going to help anyone." "I think it will," I said, my voice calm. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. "I was at the office last night." Mark's composure didn't slip, but I saw a flicker in his eyes, a momentary tightening around his mouth. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. "You broke in." "I found the key," I replied, letting the ambiguity hang in the air. "I was looking through the old files for the Ashworth project." "You remember the Ashworth project, don't you, Mark? It was a mess. So many invoices, so many payment authorizations. It would have been easy for things to get lost in the shuffle." I watched him, my focus narrowed down to this single man. I saw the way his hand tightened on Sarah's shoulder, the slight sheen of sweat that had appeared on his brow. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "I think you do," I said. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the invoices. I stood up and walked over to the heavy mahogany coffee table, placing them down side by side, the forged signatures clearly visible. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Mid-Valley Mechanical," I said, tapping the first one. "Apex Wiring Solutions. Do those names ring a bell, Mark? They were shell corporations you set up to funnel $250,000 out of my father's company. You created these fake invoices, you forged my signature, and you buried them in the paperwork of a failing project, knowing I would take the fall." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sarah stared at the papers on the table, her face ashen. She looked up at her husband, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading question. Mark let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "This is insane. You're insane. You get kicked out of the family for being a thief, and you come back 5 years later with this fantasy? You forged these, didn't you? Trying to shift the blame." "Did I?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "I also found the corporate registration documents. Both companies registered to a P.O. box in Danvers. Funny thing about that. Isn't that where your cousin lives, Mark? The one who's an accountant?" Mark's face went white. The mask was gone. In its place was the raw, primal fear of a cornered animal. Sarah let out a small, choked sob and pulled away from him, stumbling back as if his touch had burned her. "Sarah, baby, he's lying," Mark said, his voice cracking, turning to her with a desperate appeal. "You know me. I would never do that. He's trying to tear us apart." But it was too late. The lie was unraveling, and we could all see the ugly truth beneath it. I looked at my sister, and in her eyes I saw not just shock, but a dawning, horrifying recognition. "The late nights," she whispered, her voice trembling, more to herself than to anyone else. "You were always so stressed about money back then, even though you said your promotion was coming. The credit card bills you tried to hide, the trip to Vegas you said was a work conference." Her voice trailed off as the small, forgotten puzzle pieces of her life clicked into a new, hideous picture. She knew. On some level, she must have always suspected something was wrong, but she had chosen not to see it. She had chosen the comfortable lie. "It wasn't like that," Mark stammered, his eyes darting between all of us, looking for an ally and finding none. I had some debts. I got in over my head, but I was going to pay it back. I just needed a loan, a way to get back on my feet. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for Ethan to get banished. I finished for him, the word tasting like acid. You let me get banished. You stood by and watched as my father disowned me, as my family turned their backs on me. You stood at my sister's side and comforted her, all while you were the snake in the garden. You didn't just steal money, Mark. You stole my life. The room was silent again, the confession hanging in the air like poison gas. My mother had sunk onto the sofa, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sarah was staring at her husband with an expression of such profound betrayal and disgust that it was painful to watch. Mark, seeing that it was all over, seemed to deflate. The fight went out of him, replaced by a sullen, pathetic resentment. He had everything, he muttered, looking at me with a venomous hatred. The name, the inheritance, the future. It was all just handed to him. I had to work for every single thing I had. It wasn't fair. So you destroyed my family to make things fair? I shot back, the heat of my anger finally boiling over. You poisoned my father against me. You broke my mother's heart. You lied to your wife for 5 years, all because you were jealous? Before he could answer, the front door opened and closed. We all froze. A new figure stood in the doorway of the living room, leaning heavily on a cane. It was my father. He was dressed in his pajamas and a robe, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying, lucid fire. He must have checked himself out, driven himself home. The sheer force of his will was a palpable thing in the room. He had heard everything. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on Mark, a look of such cold, concentrated fury that it seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. The only sound was the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of his cane on the hardwood floor as he slowly, deliberately, walked towards the center of the room. He stopped in front of Mark, his frail body seeming to draw on some hidden reserve of strength, making him appear taller, stronger. You, my father said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that promised retribution. You did this. You did this to my son. To my family. Mark shrank back, his face a mask of pure terror. Richard, I can explain. My father raised his cane, his hand trembling with a combination of weakness and rage. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to strike him. But he didn't. He let the cane fall back to his side with a clatter. Get out, he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a final judgment. Get out of my house. And if you are not out of my company and out of my daughter's life by the end of the day, I will spend every last dollar I have to see you in prison for the rest of your miserable life. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled out of the room, not even glancing back at his wife. We heard the front door slam shut, the sound echoing through the house like a death knell for a life that had been built on a lie. And then there were 4. The room was heavy with the aftermath, the air thick with shame, regret, and 5 years of unspoken pain. My father stood there, swaying slightly, his strength seeming to desert him now that the confrontation was over. He leaned heavily on his cane, his breathing ragged. Finally, slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me with such hatred in the hospital, were now filled with a deep, bottomless well of sorrow and regret. The anger was gone, replaced by a pain so profound it was like looking into a raw wound. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his face crumpled, and a single tear traced a path down his pale, wrinkled cheek. He took a shaky, unsteady step towards me, then another. He reached out a trembling hand, not to strike me, but to grip my arm, his fingers surprisingly strong, as if he were afraid I might vanish. My boy, he rasped, his voice breaking. My son, what have we done? The dam inside me broke. All the years of anger, of loneliness, of feeling like a ghost in my own life, came flooding out. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around his frail shoulders, holding him up as much as he was holding on to me. He felt so fragile, like a bird with a broken wing. He buried his face in my shoulder, and I could feel the tremor of his sobs shaking his entire body. Behind me, I heard my mother's weeping, raw and unrestrained, and Sarah's quiet, heartbroken sniffles. We stood there, a family shattered and broken, clinging to each other in the ruins of the life we had once known, trying to find our way back from the darkness. The house no longer smelled of lemon polish and potpourri. It smelled of regret. The days that followed were quiet and strange, filled with the awkward, hesitant gestures of a family learning how to be a family again. Mark was gone, his belongings cleared out of the house in a silent, efficient purge, as if trying to erase any evidence he had ever existed. Lawyers were involved, papers were signed, and my sister began the slow, painful process of dismantling her marriage. She moved into the guest room, a ghost in her own home, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed, her face a mask of grief and shame. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a monotone whisper. She couldn't look at me directly, and I understood why. Every time she saw me, she was confronted with the magnitude of her betrayal. Not a malicious betrayal, but one born of willful blindness, of choosing a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. My father was recovering, his physical strength slowly returning, but the emotional toll was immense. The rage he had harbored for me for 5 years had been a source of fuel, and now, without it, he seemed lost, adrift in a sea of guilt. We spent hours together, not talking much, but just being in the same room. We would sit on the back porch, the air smelling of freshly cut grass and impending rain, and watch the sky change color. He would tell me stories about the business, about projects he was planning, but his heart wasn't in it. The legacy he had fought so hard to build had been tainted, not by my failure, but by his own catastrophic misjudgment. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, golden shafts of light across the lawn, he turned to me, his face serious. "The company is yours, Ethan," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "If you want it, it always should have been." I looked out at the familiar backyard, at the old oak tree whose branches were now dark silhouettes against the fiery sky. For 5 years, all I had wanted was to hear those words, to have my name cleared, to reclaim my stolen future. But now that it was being offered to me, a hollow ache spread through my chest. "I can't, Dad," I said softly. He looked crestfallen. "Why not? It's your birthright. We can fix this. We can rebuild." "I know," I said, and my voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "But I can't go back. That life, that person, he doesn't exist anymore. I spent 5 years building a new life for myself from nothing. It's not much, just a small apartment and a job that pays the bills. But it's mine. I earned it. I can't just step back into the old one as if nothing happened." He was quiet for a long time, just staring at his hands, the skin thin and spotted with age. "I understand," he finally said, his voice raspy. "I robbed you of 5 years. I don't have the right to ask you for a single day more." My mother, too, was a study in quiet remorse. The brittle, polished facade was gone, replaced by a fragile, uncertain woman who seemed to have aged a decade in a week. She would make me my favorite meals, her hands fussing and fluttering around me, a silent apology in every gesture. She tried to talk to me one afternoon, her eyes swimming with tears. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered, her hand clutching my arm. "I should have believed you. A mother should know her own son. But I was so worried about appearances, about what people would say. I was a coward. I didn't have the heart to argue with her. I just nodded, because what was there to say? Forgiveness felt like a distant country I wasn't sure I knew how to get to. I stayed for 2 weeks, until my father was steady on his feet and a fragile, tentative peace had settled over the house. But it was the peace of a battlefield after the fighting is over, quiet, but littered with wreckage. The trust, the easy intimacy of a family, had been a casualty of the war. We were all survivors, but we were all deeply wounded. The morning I left, the air was cool and crisp with the promise of autumn. I packed my single bag and put it in the trunk of my car. My mother hugged me at the door, a real hug this time, one that was fierce and desperate. She clung to me, her familiar lilac perfume filling my senses, but this time it didn't make me nauseous. It just made me sad. My father walked me to my car, leaning on his cane. "You'll call?" he asked, his voice gruff, trying and failing to hide the vulnerability in his eyes. "I'll call," I promised. As I was about to get in my car, Sarah came out of the house. She stopped a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. "Ethan," she said, her voice small. I don't know if you can ever forgive me. For not believing you. For choosing him." I looked at my sister, at the shared history in her sad, familiar face. The anger was gone, burned away, leaving behind only a deep, weary sorrow. "I don't know either, Sarah," I said, and it was the most honest thing I had said in years. "But I'm your brother. That's a start." A small, watery smile touched her lips. "Yeah," she whispered. "A start." I got in my car and started the engine. I looked at them one last time, my father, my mother, my sister, standing in the driveway of the house that was no longer my home. They looked like a photograph, frozen in a moment of quiet grief. As I pulled away, the crunch of the gravel under my tires was the only sound. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The past was behind me, a landscape of pain and betrayal. Ahead of me was the open road, and a life that was my own. I was no longer banished. I was free. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, I drove toward it, leaving the ghosts of Hawthorne Lane to their haunting. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt like mine.